Hello, I live in the countryside and want to learn a little bit more about it, so we're going to make some films, starting this fun little pilot episode in which we're going to talk about hedges. So let's see what people have been saying about them.
They're a symbol of the British landscape, a rich tapestry of nature, home to birds, to insects and to flowers. But hedges are under threat.
A report released today by the National Trust and shared exclusively with this programme shows we're still obliterating our ancient hedgerows. Indeed, just on National Trust land, across the last 100 years, they reckon they've lost around a third of these natural boundaries. More widely, the figure is around 50%.
Let's unpack. The press release referred to in this report says that in the UK, hedgerow loss since the Second World War, particularly from 1945 to 1990, has been well documented, with 50% of hedges lost due to changes in farming policy, increases in mechanisation, blah, 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 blah. The Soil Association made exactly the same claim, which appeared on their website before the National Trust report was released. However, Natural England, an advisory body to the government who want to see a 61% increase in hedgerows, actually offer some statistics on the matter. If you do the maths, the rapid decline since the Second World War amounts to 17.4% of the total. The more astute amongst us will have noticed that this 17.4% figure is much different from the earlier 50% figure, which means they can't both be true. So which one is it, and why lie about that? Thankfully, during the Second World War, they took lots of photos from the sky, so we're going to play a fun game of Spot the Difference. Incidentally, this is where some of my ancestors used to farm. You can see on the left-hand side some of the hedges have thinned out, while in the top right some of the field has been made a bit bigger, but most of it looks pretty well the same, other than this development, which doesn't look agricultural. In this case, the little forests all dotted around seem to have actually grown in most cases. At the top right there's some new hedges by the looks of it. Field in this blue circle looks like it used to be divided up, but I can't see any hedges there. But a few have been lost towards the left of the screen. This case looks more like the hedges have just been left to decay, because you can still see trees where there used to be field boundaries. In a few instances it does look like the hedge has been removed completely, but in the wartime maps it looks like these were already decaying then. There's also this whole new forest. This wartime photograph doesn't really have any hedges, although by the present day, the big circle has been split in two by a line of trees, and another slang of trees has emerged to the right of the picture. Doesn't look too bad. Now, if you're thinking that I've picked these examples because they suit my argument, I encourage you to look for yourself. These are from the National Library of Scotland, but if you Google historical aerial photographs, you'll have pictures from all over the country at your disposal. Hedges are quite important for our conception of the countryside. They make up our quilted patchwork, the little borders around each parcel of our green and pleasant land. But the spiky hawthorn or blackthorn hedge most of us are used to is actually quite a modern development. They're neither
Ancient, natural.
They emerged in the 18th century with something called enclosure. Back when everyone was a peasant, we had the open field system of farming, where tiny strips of land were cultivated by households on a rotating basis. But animals were grazed on common land, the right to which was shared by the whole community. Some examples of this survive today, like Port Meadow in Oxford, which sustains lots of friendly horses and cattle and students who go there to get drunk because they enjoy being cold and a really long way from any amenities. This system didn't have hedges. Hedges on common land are a disadvantage, as you don't want to restrict the movement of your animals, as they've got to compete with everybody else to eat as much grass as possible. But over time, the value of land and labour shifted, and the hedge became the outline of something new, an incentive for improvement. Port Meadow isn't suitable for ploughing as it floods, hence this greyish splodge you can see, so it's only suitable for grazing. Let's say that the amount of grass it produces each year can support 4 cattle, and the land is grazed by 4 peasants. This means each peasant only has 1 cow on the common, as if any of them were to have 2, it would push the total amount of cows up to 5, which is more than the land can support, and all the animals would go hungry, including their own. Now the Red Farmer has an idea. He thinks that if a ditch is dug to fix the flooding, the improvement would allow an additional 4 cattle to be supported, which would raise the total to 8. So if he goes ahead and drains the land, this is my clip art of a drain, he can have an extra 4 cattle. Much more profitable. However, his 3 competitors can see that he's just spent all this money draining the land, and he's doubled the amount of grass there, but there's nothing stopping them capitalising on that as well, so each of them will double the amount of animals they have on the common, which pushes the total well above even what the drained land can support, and again, all of the animals go hungry. Instead, the drained land will reach a new equilibrium whereby all of the peasants there have 2 rather than 1 animal, but the Red Farmer has shouldered 100% of the cost for this improvement, and is only getting 25% of the benefit. And that's not fair, so in reality the common land would go unimproved and not reach its full potential. This is the tragedy of the commons in its most basic form, and Port Meadow shows some signs of it today. You see all the weeds in the front of the shot here. If you introduce private property by enclosing these open fields with hedges, it makes improvement possible. Enclosure allowed peasants to buy or rent their own land and establish the boundaries with hedges. Now, the red farmer can build the drain and allow his land to support an extra 2 cattle. The other farmers can see his success and copy it on their own plots. The blue farmer failed to get any enclosed land, so has gone off to live in a town or suffer some other unfortunate existence. But thanks to these improvements, he can buy surplus food and partake in the Industrial Revolution. So the coming of hedges pushed the peasant into new categories. The landless proletarians in the cities and the farmers in the countryside as we understand them today. With the coming of the humble hedge, the peasant became the farmer, and they now had their own land and could do what they felt best with it. This was immensely successful. Writer and agriculturalist Arthur Young toured Oxfordshire in 1813 and wrote that Fringford had been improved greatly in rent and produce since enclosure, at least trebled in both. But that's about enclosure. What about hedges themselves? Now, of course, they have benefits. They provide habitats for wildlife, provide boundaries for property, and they split parcels of land up into manageable sections. If land is split up into different fields, it allows animals to be grazed on just one part of it at a time. And this means that in any one place, the grass is only grazed occasionally, which gives it more time to grow and ultimately means that there's more of it, which is very efficient. Managing the land for stock tends to be why hedges exist within a farm. Parts of the country that are less suited to animals tend not to have quite so many. But we've got to be realistic. They are just hedges. It's often touted that they improve soil quality, which is partially true but misleading. These 2 jars in front of me represent soil. This one supports a field that's cropped and this one supports a hedge. So inside the jar is nutrients, minerals and energy that's stored within the soil. Every year, sticks and leaves will fall off the hedge, transferring nutrients from the wind, rain and sun into the soil beneath it. And as nothing is taken out of the soil, this just makes it slightly better every year, which means in the long run it's going to be really fertile. This also happens with crop soil as manure and fertilisers are spread on it to increase its fertility. But on crop soil, the harvest sees a lot of this goodness removed in the form of food. So while fertility will accumulate in soil beneath hedges, you can't crop it, so there's no productive way to harvest it and it's of no agricultural use whatsoever. I also don't buy that they stop floods. The argument here is essentially that the shrubs will be able to soak up more water, but if the soil is already saturated, you can presume that the plants on top of it will be as well. So then any additional water, which is what a flood is, will surely be completely unaffected. And besides, you don't solve drainage problems with hedges, you solve them with drains. Similarly, it's often claimed that hedges stop fertilisers and soil being washed away, but this article from 2021 says no one's really looked into it, with no field-based quantitative comparison having taken place. They basically say that hedges are extremely variable in stopping flows of water, although perhaps slightly better than pasture.
And replanting new hedges as well connects up habitats, it creates corridors, much better for wildlife.
They're not that, that's not what they are. A wildlife corridor is a strip of forest or a bridge that allows movement and migration, which is just not what a hedge is. The Woodland Trust provide funding for hedges that creates new ecological links, which is something to be aware of. But they use this image which suggests that birds can't fly over fields or deer couldn't walk across it. It's as if the natural world is participating in this great game of the floor is lava. If you take a look at pretty much any field, you will see the tracks that are made by wild animals, and they tend to go from A directly to B, which is almost never in line with the hedges. And obviously, wildlife can eat the stuff in fields. The deer will eat the grasses, the birds eat the cereals. It's not like farmland is ecologically dead. Some charities also suggest that hedges are magical, making bold, unsubstantiated statements. Scientists have reported that in just 7 days, a 1 metre length of well-managed, dense hedge will mop up the same amount of pollution that a car emits on a 500-mile drive. There's no source on that. If a hedge stays the same over a period of time, the amount of carbon in it won't change. Unfortunately, they don't work as a perpetual carbon sink. They do impact soil carbon, however. These 3 graphs show the amount of carbon stored in soil as they move away from 3 different types of field boundary into the field. On average, but not in every example, the hedges themselves have the highest soil carbon content. But you see that in a lot of places this plummets, and in others it actually goes up as we move away from the hedge and into the field. In fact, the only 2 instances of consistently high carbon storage occur in fields without hedges, and whatever's happening in these examples is probably what we'd want to be looking for if we were trying to sequester more carbon. So we probably don't want to destroy existing carbon stocks in hedges, but they don't really seem like the answer as far as climate change mitigation is concerned. So if most hedges are not very old at all, particularly not in the grand schemes of the natural world, why has their outlining position in our countryside been uprooted since 1945? Mechanisation or industrial farming practices are usually blamed.
It was post the Second World War, it was that need to produce lots of food, and so it was easier to have bigger fields, and that meant pulling out hedgerows.
Most hedges also have ditches alongside them, so if you wanted to merge 2 fields together by removing the hedge, you'd also have to fill in the ditch, which would make the land wetter and therefore of poorer quality. But most immediately, it's much easier just to make a combine-sized gap in a hedge rather than rip the whole thing out, so that is what a lot of people do. And it is true that cutting hedges is a bit of a faff. Today most people use these hydraulic flail cutters, which are pretty simple. This bit just spins so fast you can't even see it and smashes the hedge to pieces. But don't worry, it's illegal to cut hedges during bird nesting season unless needed for road safety. Finishing a hedge completely will take about 5 passes at this absolute crawling pace. You've got to look behind yourself the whole time as well, because that's where the machine is. So it's slow and boring and loud and makes your neck ache and rubbish. So they're just a cost to the business. You've got to cut them every couple of years or so. But if the decline was since 1945, what did farmers before the war think? Into the 19th century, hedges were still associated with enclosure and its improvements. Arthur Young discusses enclosure much more than hedges, giving examples of a very great improvement at Hampton Boyle, but he doesn't like hedges. If ditches are wanted for drains, these do not necessarily imply hedges. He actually goes as far as to say that hedges endanger the benefits of enclosure, as trees without a doubt check the growth of crops. Hedges harbour a quantity of small birds which always do damage to corn. Also, interestingly, he sees no economic advantage in wood as fuel. Hedgewood never pays the expense of setting, repairing, cutting and making. So he thinks hedges create shade and harbours pests, both bad for farming. Then if we zoom ahead to 1868, when enclosure is no longer at the cutting edge of farming practice, DFG MacDonald actually echoes Young's sentiment. Despite all their claims, picturesque and social, the extent of hedges in England is agriculturally a heavy loss. A considerable portion of the soil is altogether sacrificed for the purpose of obtaining boundaries where no boundaries are needed. Shelter they afford is more than counterbalanced by the obstacles which they present to the free circulation of sun and air and the cover which they supply for insects and vermin. If there be few or no animals kept in the fields, it's difficult to see what we want with internal hedges at all. A light, strong fence would seem more efficient. Both Young and MacDonald see little point in a hedge not demarking a property boundary. Interestingly, MacDonald also says the more regular the better of field size, and 10 acres had been pronounced the minimum size which can be advantageously adopted on a farm cultivated by horsepower, which is exactly the sentiment post-war farming is accused of introducing. So it sounds like farmers' ambivalent relationship with hedges predates 1945. Cutting and laying hedges back then was an art that differed from county to county. Some folks did enjoy it.
Oh, lovely.
What did that?
Lovely to cut and lay eggs and stand back and look at it. I don't think there's enough young chaps taking it up, but I don't think they'll like the £6 axe.
With a flail cutter, it's possible to maintain this wall of foliage you see behind me. If that was periodically cut and laid, it would barely be a third of the height. The ecological value of cut and laid hedges is overstated, I think. I mean, they're so thin and close to the ground. Why would a bird nest in one if they have this available? The only remnant of a cut and laid hedge I found on our farm is this, which has now grown into a cut and laid tree. As modern methods of hedgerow management essentially just cap the size of the hedge, new species are able to seed and grow there. Our hedges have holly and elder and self-seeded fruit trees that just wouldn't be present if we periodically went through cutting and laying, maintaining a strictly hawthorn hedge. We get a small amount of government funding to offset the cost of maintaining our hedges, but this comes with an attempt to gaslight us into believing that hedges increase yields, which, as we have seen, was not true when Arthur Young was writing, and still isn't true now. So do we need to worry about the condition of hedges in England? I would say not really. There are reasons to remove them, but there's also lots of reasons to keep them, or at least tolerate them. And this has created an equilibrium, which might be 17.4% lower than it was in 1945, but I think that it's an equilibrium we can trust. Farmers are not a threat to our hedges. They are very literally their guardians and creators, maintaining a wonderful example of how human civilization and wildlife can coexist. And I think that is a success.